Last night, former Fox News host Tucker Carlson had the audacity for a second time this year to go and talk to a senior Russian leader and publicize this interview, this time with Sergey Lavrov, foreign minister, longtime foreign minister for the Russian side. Now, one of the things we harp on this channel all the time is you have to talk to everybody. You have to talk to people, even if you detest them. You still have to talk to people, because if you're not talking to the other side, however defined, then you don't even have the basis to find out how you can have an outcome in whatever's going on that's beneficial to your side. You've got to understand what motivates them, what they want, what they have to have, what they're willing to negotiate on, and what's not that important. Otherwise, you're literally just firing in the dark and have little chance of success, which we've seen a lot of in the last 2 decades. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about this interview in detail, because I think it's very illuminating in certain regards. There's some areas where it leads to some concern, and there's some areas that do lead towards hope and possibility, especially with the incoming Trump administration. So this is not a situation to where, it's always those evil Russians and, and here's Putin, Tucker, who's a Putin apologist or whatever. Not the case. This is somebody who says, hey, what is your view on things? And then when you have a little bit more understanding of what they said, and as you're going to see throughout this episode here, in context, what were people saying at the time? Very often somebody can come in and have revisionist history and say one thing, but something else was different at the time, or they were very different at the time. I'm going to show you how a lot of the things that the Russians have been saying in context have been pretty consistent with us going through. And unfortunately, you're going to see some Americans who do enter into revisionist history. And it's important to understand, because anytime an American is going to see this, because of how we've been indoctrinated, the other side, again, anytime no matter who it is, the other side is all about propaganda. Oh, don't believe anything they say, because it's nothing but a bunch of propaganda. You can't trust it anyway. Well, I'm going to show you that actually it is not all propaganda. And in fact, they're not the only ones engaging in propaganda. But I do also concede that you do have to parse through things, and you do have to keep a little bit of skepticism that anyone's going to give an impression from their perspective. And so you have to take everything with a grain of salt. And as always the case, both with us or any other side, it's the actions that matter most. That's where the rubber meets the road situation. But with that caveat, let's go ahead and jump into it. One of the things that the Russians have said really from the outset, I remember Vladimir Putin said this in the first few weeks of the war. He said that we didn't start this war, the other side did. And of course, he was mocked and just like ridiculed for saying, well, obviously you invaded in February 2022, and now you want to claim that the Ukraine side actually started the war? Well, that's because we didn't pay attention to what he said. We didn't listen because we didn't want to. It's a lot funner and easier to just dismiss him and ridicule him of saying what you said is self-evidently untrue. But Russia don't believe that the war started in February 2022. They believe that it started in February 2014. And in their view, there was a coup that was taking place against the legitimate, democratically elected leader, Yanukovych of Ukraine, was ousted from power through violence. They call that a coup. Now, interesting, in the West, we always say it's freedom fighters, and it was just the people rising up to display their desire for something different. We'll see about how that works out and how the two sides characterize that same thing. But it's important to understand it from the Russian perspective. This started not in 2022, but in 2014, as Lavrov said yesterday.
Had the coup in February 2014, had it not happened, and had the deal which was reached the day before between the then president and the opposition implemented, Ukraine would have stayed one piece by now with Crimea in it. It's absolutely clear. They did not deliver on the deal. Instead, they staged the coup. The deal, by the way, provided for creation of a government of national unity in February 2014 and holding early elections, which the then president would have lost. Everybody knew that. But they were impatient, and they took the government buildings next morning. They went to this Maidan Square and announced that they created the government of the winners.
That is so instructive right there, what he said. He was talking about what had happened during the whole violence in the Maidan, the uprising, what we like to call a color revolution, at least in many parts of the Western world, it was rising up against Yanukovych. A lot of violence in the square. You remember all those images and videos from the Maidan Square and people shooting back and forth. A lot of people dying, especially on the, I believe it was the 19th and 20th or 20th and 21st of February 2014. And there was representatives from the West. I think it was France, Germany, and maybe the UK. I can't remember who the third one was. And then they went in there with the Yanukovych government and they said, okay, look, how about this? Let's agree to early elections. So all these people are rising up. They don't like it. All this was sparked, by the way, by Yanukovych signing a deal with Russia that says, hey, we're going to be looking more east than west instead of to the west, Western Europe. And that sparked a lot of uprising. People weren't happy about that. But so Yanukovych said, all right, tell you what, we'll agree to early elections in just a few months' time, in May, I think is the term. And he said, okay, that will end this. And then we'll just say, all right, the people will get their say at the ballot box. Now, Lavrov just acknowledged that. And he said everybody knew that Yanukovych was going to lose. We knew. And yet they agreed with it. The Russians agreed with that and said, sure, we'll support that. So he was going to follow a democratically elected or a democratic system that said we're going to allow an election and a vote that we don't think our side is going to win, but that's how it works. But instead, that was not enough, and the rebels were not willing to do that. Now, if you think that's revisionist history, let me show you something that a guest that appears on our show many times, John Mearsheimer, said in 2015, so barely a year later, he gave a speech at the University of Chicago where he said this.
And then in the February 18th through February 20th time period, lots of people die. It's really messy. And what happens is that a number of European foreign ministers, the German foreign minister, French foreign minister, they fly to Kiev, and a deal is worked out to have elections that will, in effect, remove Yanukovych from power. But the protesters refuse to accept the deal. And there are significant fascist elements among the protesters who are armed, right? There's killing on the Maidan. And as a result, Yanukovych flees for his life to Russia.
And listen, that is so telling there. So that is, again, in context of the time that this was happening. John Mearsheimer was laying this stuff out. It was a very long speech presentation that you can see online. Just Google that from 2015, John Mearsheimer, and you can watch the whole thing for yourself. It is very, very telling because it just lays out what actually happened, which lines up exactly with what Lavrov just said yesterday. So now imagine the results of this, the ramifications. Had we just said, okay, we're going to actually follow the rule of law. We're actually going to do democracy. We claim to stand for that all the time, the rules-based order, all that kind of stuff. Had we allowed that deal to go through and not supported the violent protesters after the deal that our side helped negotiate, there likely would never have been a war. There likely would never have been a war in 2022. Because at that time, this is before Crimea. At that time, and Jacques Beau, Colonel Jacques Beau has been on our channel to talk about this a lot. You had the map of Ukraine, and it was full to include Crimea at that time. If we had just let the process follow and let the rule of law apply and let democracy have its say at the ballot box, then almost certainly Russia would then not have taken Crimea. I'm sorry. They would not have annexed that because they were not going to allow, once they saw the coup take place, that they were not going to allow the Ukraine to go into NATO when they have a military base, their biggest Black Sea fleet at Sevastopol in the southern part of Crimea. And since the population is 90-something% ethnic Russians, they took that. They did a plebiscite. The West panned it, of course. They said it wasn't real. Ironically, anytime you're talking about votes, if it doesn't go the way we want, it wasn't real. And if it does, well, okay, yeah, that's democracy, whatever. Double standards are evident. They're all over the place. But had that deal gone through, and let's say that the rebel side won the election in May, like Lavrov and John Mearsheimer both said was almost certain to be the case, they would have had all of Ukraine. Their side would have won, and they would have had the entire country, all of it, in Ukraine control. Then Russia would have had to figure out what they're going to do with their Black Sea fleet. But if the elections had gone through, all that stuff would have happened, and therefore there would never have been a war in 2022. Because the whole reason why there was a war in 2022 was combination of NATO continuing to say they're going to bring Ukraine into NATO, and then this huge shelling and the laws that were passed against the Russian speakers in the Donbass area, all the shelling that had been going on, and basically the civil war that had been fighting. And that the Russian ethnic Russians in the Donbass area in the far eastern part were being killed in large numbers. Lots of people dying on both sides of that line. That was the ultimate trigger that led Russia to invade. In fact, actually, the trigger was I believe it was the March 2021 declaration by the now Zelensky government, who I think he was elected in 2019, said we're going to take back all of these territories we've lost, to include Crimea, by force if necessary. Then that was what started the countdown to the war that came the following February. Those are the facts, folks. That's the reality here. So let's make sure that we're dealing with everything above board for what happened in that case. Now, one of the other things that took place around the same time, and it was mentioned in this interview also, was Victoria Nuland. And, we've talked about her involvement in this a lot, but I want to show you something that she said afterwards as kind of a mea culpa, to where she's talking about, how Putin viewed this things and how she's going to say, here's what the truth is.
The interest, in our view, of helping create a diverse democratic opportunity for anybody who wanted to run, but for Putin, it was seen as a challenge. I remember being in a meeting between him and Secretary Kerry, in which he talked about that period as the U.S. embassy running oppositional candidates out of the embassy, which was, of course, ludicrous. We wouldn't do that. We can't do that. In his narrative of grievance, we had put our thumb on the scale in favor of his opponents, that we had sided with the Bolotnaya protesters. We, of course, never choose candidates in any country. But what we do in countries that proclaim to be democracies is we offer the opportunity for candidates of all kinds to learn how to put themselves forward to best effect. And we always support the right of peaceful political protest in any country, as long as it doesn't become violent. So to him, this was all a challenge to his autocratic desire to control the situation.
Golly, that is so ironic and humiliating and just depressing for me as an American to hear, because we know for sure she's lying. Obviously, we did put our thumb on the scale. We had a chance for a peaceful election to end the violent protest, and we supported it. And then, of course, we have the infamous phone call that was intercepted between Victoria Nuland and the ambassador in Ukraine, where we're expressly talking about who's going to be able to lead, which candidate do we want to elevate, etc. All those things that she says, well, of course we don't do. Naturally we did, and she was caught on it. Absolutely caught red-handed with this phone call. And what's even more perverse and just disappointing is that after the fact, she just kind of laughed it off. Like, well, I guess that kind of sounds like my voice a little bit, something like that. Didn't even deny that it happened. But of course, there's no point in denying it at that point, because it's out there. And of course, the infamous pictures of her on Maidan Square handing out cookies to all the protesters, etc., the people who are protesting against the legally elected government that we claim to want to support with the whole process and stuff. And so for that smug look on her face and to claim that, we're all about peaceful everything and it's those darn Russians that, have to change the tune. Look, the Russians in this case were right, at least on this point. And everyone knows that she's lying. And that just gets to one of the bigger points that we are suffering from now. There is a cost to this stuff because it builds up. Do you wonder why in America by itself, the trust in government is at an all-time low and it keeps deteriorating? It's because of stuff like this. It's self-evident that you're lying. We have your own voice on record talking about it. We have Professor John Mearsheimer pointing it out. There's all kinds of other evidence, direct evidence that shows this. There's simply the fact that after we negotiated with the Western powers that the illegally elected government of Yanukovych would stand for election, he didn't have to, but that we got him to agree to it anyway, and then we supported his ouster after that. Putting to the lie that we didn't care anything about democracy. We just wanted our side in there by whatever means. And when people see this around the world, even outside of the United States, it diminishes our credibility further. So people don't believe things they hear. They don't take anything at face value because they see that so many times we say one thing and do another. Look, this isn't a matter of spinning and trying to get your way or being creative with some of the facts, which by themselves start to become problems. But when you just outright lie, and then you have this smug look on your face and basically saying, I don't care who knows, because we're the most powerful country and we're going to do whatever we want to do. That just continues to erode the basis, the foundation for people to believe in the United States and to support and to follow us and to do things that we want them to do internationally. So it deteriorates our ability to influence things abroad. That has costs to us, and we're seeing those costs are starting to pile up over time. And the people of Ukraine, frankly, have been the biggest losers in all of this, because had we just abided by the democratic values at the time, there would not have been any war. All of Ukraine, including the Crimea, would almost certainly, or very likely, still belong to Kiev right now. All these cities that have fallen, all the cities that have been wiped out, that turned to veritable rubble, and the hundreds of thousands of people who have been killed and wounded, the millions upon millions who have been driven out of the country, likely never to return, the majority, none of that would have happened. But because we decided that we knew better and that we didn't care about the processes, these things are starting to pile up. Now, it's bad up to this point. Now, as we're talking, especially because the new administration's coming in, things could get even worse, or they could finally tip over and start going back to something that makes sense. And that's where I'm certainly hopeful that we're going to now. But I want to look at some of a couple of other reasons, things that he pointed out there. He talks about why people fight. Now, we just described how we set a lot of this stuff in motion by taking some really bad decisions, politically, diplomatically, electorally, et cetera, that fed the case that helped lead to this war that so many people have died on both sides of the line, by the way, because the Russians have suffered terribly from this as well, in terms of personnel. But in this, he describes a couple of the reasons why we fight. He's going to contrast that in the first case to something that Lindsey Graham, not a good mouthpiece that I want representing the United States, but he so often does because people put a microphone on his face and he loves to talk. So Lavrov talked about why we fight, and he talked about why Russia fights.
Lindsey Graham, who visited some time ago Zelensky for another talk, he bluntly, in presence of Zelensky, I think, said that Ukraine is very rich with rare earth metals, and we cannot leave this richness to the Russians. We must take it.
I'm here with President Zelensky. I am such an admirer of what you and your country have done. You're trying to stop the Russians so we don't have to fight them. They don't want any American troops. They just need the weapons to free their country of a terrible invasion. They're sitting on $1 trillion worth of minerals that could be good to our economy. So I want to keep helping our friends in Ukraine. We can win this. They need our help.
We fight, so they fight for the regime which is ready to sell or to give to the West all the natural and human resources. We fight for the people who have been living on these lands, whose ancestors were actually developing those lands, building cities, building factories for centuries and centuries. We care about people, not about natural resources, which somebody in the United States would like to keep and to have Ukrainians just as servants sitting on these natural resources.
Now, you may be tempted, if you're an American, to say, well, that's just his take. Lavrov's just saying how they care about people, but he doesn't really. They care about power, because the narrative in the West has always been that Russia is on a power hungry. They want it. They want to resurrect the Soviet Union, and they want to just use their power to take over everything. And if we don't stop them here in Ukraine, they're coming for us. All that kind of stuff. It's all nonsense. There's no evidence to back that up. But we have his comments here that this is why we're fighting. Now, don't dismiss this out of hand, because there is much in Russia where they do actually care about the people, and especially about history and about the traditions and the time, a lot of time of different over different centuries and whatnot. I mean, they go back in this. Their memory is a lot longer than ours is, because they've been directly affected. We've talked before about how they were invaded, last century by the West in the Nazis, and by the previous century by the French in the attack on Moscow, etc. And now then here comes NATO on the same path that both of those previous ones took up. So it means a lot to them, and they pay a lot of attention to the people there and to their history and their traditions and their culture, etc. Don't dismiss that out of hand, because when someone is fighting because of that, there is almost nothing they won't sacrifice to succeed. Understand that. And if our side is fighting, you talk about just dismiss words. Well, how can you then dismiss what Lindsey Graham says? This is all about money. And believe me, how many times have we shown you over the last couple of years, especially, all this time about Zelensky and all these pictures that Gary keeps popping up there ever so often from December 2023 about all the arms makers in America. They all went and had their big hands around. Yeah, I knew you'd have that one up there. This big happy family, it's all about cash. It's all about a lot of the arms makers in the arms industry, politicians who benefit from it. A lot of these people do it. That you've had, I think we've definitely seen Victoria Nuland, Secretary of State Austin, Secretary of Defense Austin, Secretary of State Blinken, Biden himself. We've shown you many times where they always want to point out, and Republicans too. I think let's see, the senator from Kansas or Kentucky, I'm sorry, the former, what was the Speaker of the Senate, always went on and saying about how all these jobs are going to be created. We keep giving this money because of all these jobs it's going to create in America and how it's going to help our economy. And now then here you have Lindsey Graham saying this. It's not just one guy. It's not just one party. It's across the board. Everybody talks about we're fighting for money. Now, sure, we want to hurt Russia. That's cool. But we really want to see what we can get out of it. That's what we're saying out loud, and that's matching up with what we're doing here. And listen, if you're just fighting for cash, there's going to come a day when the cash flow doesn't work, when the profit loss thing doesn't work in your favor. You're going to walk away from that. You're not going to keep going down because you're emotionally not attached, and you're not fighting for your survival. So you'll walk away from that. And I think that the Ukraine people are going to discover that to their chagrin. Just like the situation did in Vietnam, just like the situation did in Afghanistan, once it's no longer in our favor because we're not fighting for our culture or anything like that. We're just fighting out of convenience because we can harm our enemy and maybe we can make some money in the meantime. But once those calculations change, we're out. And Russia is not fighting for that. They're not fighting for money. They're not fighting for this mythical recreation of the Soviet Union. They're fighting for their security on their border, where they have been invaded twice. Don't miss that. It is very important. He also continued on to talk about our Minsk agreements. Now, we've just discussed in some detail all the situation with the February 2014 and the negotiations, the diplomacy that went along with that, through the elections that never took place. Now then the next one came with the Minsk agreements themselves. And at the time these were negotiated, you had John Kerry, then Secretary of State, and Lavrov, who was also still the foreign minister. He's been for like 20-something years, I think the longest serving foreign minister maybe in the world, and certainly currently is. At the time, some of the words that came out of the United States were actually pretty good. Here is, first of all, Lavrov talking in the interview about the Minsk agreements.
They must understand that we would be ready to use any means not to allow them to succeed in what they call strategic defeat of Russia. They fight for keeping their hegemony over the world, on any country, any region, any continent. We fight for our legitimate security interests.
And so his point being there that, look, we're not going to stop. He just said in the previous clip there that they're fighting because of the people. And then now then here he says the U.S. says they're fighting for our strategic defeat, which Joe Biden expressly laid out and said, yes, that is our objective here. And he's saying we're never going to settle for that. And then referring back to the Minsk agreements, he had talked about his cooperation with John Kerry. In this clip I'm going to show you now, this is what Lavrov and Kerry both said about the Minsk agreements in 2015.
One of the central issues, of course, was the crisis in Ukraine. There are certain differences and disagreements between Russia and the U.S. as regards the root causes of this crisis and its prospects. But we definitely share the opinion that this issue should be resolved in an exclusively peaceful manner through comprehensive implementation of the Minsk arrangements, including a direct dialogue between Kiev, Luhansk and Donetsk on all issues laid out in the complex of measures agreed upon on February 12th in Minsk.
We are obviously in the midst of a challenging time. And here in Sochi today, I was privileged to spend many hours with Foreign Minister Lavrov and with President Putin, discussing a number of global issues on which both of our countries are very focused. I am grateful to President Putin for the significant amount of time that he made available to this discussion, for his directness, and for his very detailed explanations of Russia's position with respect to some of these challenges, and of the ways that he believed that we have an ability to be able to work constructively together in order to resolve these problems. I think the fact that leaps out at me, certainly, from this day's discussions, which is precisely what brought me here in the first place, is that there is no substitute for talking directly to key decision makers, particularly during a period that is as complex and fast-moving as this is.
Wow, that last part there, it's just like a gut punch to me. Here at one time was the U.S. Secretary of State saying it is important to talk to people you don't even like to, because otherwise how are you going to be able to have any kind of negotiated settlement that works in your favor? As opposed to the one we have now, and we played it a bunch of times, I won't pull it back up here, where he said, I'm not talking to Lavrov. I don't know what he's talking about here. I heard his speech, but we don't talk or anything else. And so there's no direct coordination in that regard. And because at the time, you see, it's also important, at the time, you had Lavrov saying, we've agreed to the Minsk agreements. We want to settle this issue in the Donbass and Donetsk and Luhansk especially peacefully. We're not looking to accelerate this. We want it to be done as according to what we've agreed to here. And as long as this turns out, everything's going to be okay, i.e., there would not have been a war in 2022 if the Minsk agreements had been passed. Now, we know from Angela Merkel and I can't remember the French leaders at the time, have both subsequently admitted that they had never any intention of actually accomplishing or performing the Minsk Accords. It was only to buy time for the Ukraine side to build up its armed forces. So again, you talk about trust in the West that is further undermined. That is going to come into play next time when Trump gets into, because the trust in anything, any kind of agreement from the West is really, really low, which means almost certainly that Russia's position is going to be, and however whatever kind of end of war termination settlement is agreed to, it's going to be something that Russia can have direct authority and power over to ensure that it's applied to this time. To where if we back out of the deal, that they will still be able to guarantee their own national security with their own forces, which means that Trump will probably get a worse deal. So people can say that Trump is going to be a great negotiator, he can get things done, but Russia will not make a deal that's not in their interest, that is not to their satisfaction, because they have the leverage. But Trump has been undermined by all the things that happened before he came into office the first time even, and all the things that have happened in the current administration, and all the things that we've said and then gone back, like Victoria Nuland, etc. So they don't believe what we say. Now, it is in their interest to find a negotiated settlement that meets their minimum standards, and those are different than the ones that Trump's going to want, and way different than the ones that Zelensky wants. Zelensky keeps still talking about, I want NATO, and I want to have a mechanism that I'll get all of my territory back in the future. That's never going to happen. Neither one of those things, ever. There's no way that happened. Russia already went to war once to prevent NATO. They'll do it again in the future if that comes back up. So they're certainly not going to agree to anything that has the word NATO anywhere associated with it. So it's going to be a difficult thing to get done here. But it's not all the bad. It can be good, as I'm going to see here in a minute. But before that, in between now and when Trump comes in, there is still this possibility of nuclear escalation. Now, when Biden allowed the long-range missiles to be used, and then Russia responded with the firing of the new Oreshnik missile, the intermediate-range ballistic missile, they have laid out the set that said, if this continues, we'll take another step. I think Putin said there will surely be a response. Now, they didn't take a response to the last long-range missiles, but there haven't been any more since that time, and they caused apparently minimal damage. It appears that Putin is saying, we're willing to eat that one and get to January 20th as long as there's not any more. And so if there are any more, whether if the Ukraine side finds some way to fire them on their own, or if the Biden administration covertly allows them to do so because they would need help from the U.S. military to do it, then all bets are off. And Tucker Carlson specifically asked Lavrov, what about the risk of nuclear escalation?
Basically, they reproduced the statement by Reagan and Gorbachev of 1987, I think, no nuclear war. And this is absolutely in our vital interest. And I hope that this is also in vital interest of the United States. I say so because some time ago, Mr. Kirby, who is White House communications coordinator or whatever, he was answering questions, and about escalation and about possibility of nuclear weapons being employed. And he said, oh, no, we don't want escalation, because then if there is some nuclear element, then our European allies would suffer. So even mentally, he excludes that the United States can suffer. And this is something which makes the situation a bit risky. It might, if this mentality prevails, then some reckless steps could be taken, and this is bad.
So what I think you're saying is American policymakers imagine there could be a nuclear exchange that doesn't directly affect the United States, and you're saying that's not true.
That's what I said, yes.
Now, that is repeating something he had said previously, a month or so ago, that the United States should disabuse themselves of the belief that if this escalates into a nuclear conflict, that our oceans and Canada and Mexico to the south are going to protect us, that our borders. He said that they won't. And it doesn't seem like the U.S. believes that. I think there is still this mentality across the board that thinks that, okay, well, we don't want nuclear escalation, but if it happens, it's going to be probably in Ukraine or maybe even somewhere in Western Europe, but definitely not here. So, and if it happens, then we'll settle down, then we'll tamp down. But Lavrov and the whole thing was very diplomatic, but that was one of the most, I think, big time impactful statements that he made, which doesn't need to be lost on anybody. He said, if escalation does come by whatever means, regardless of who may be at fault, if nuclear weapons are used, our territory is not going to be off the target list. And that should sober up anybody. Listen to me carefully. I've seen some of the comments here, even in this people here. Anytime anyone talks like this, it happens with Tucker. It's happened even with us here on the show, that they say, "Oh, you must be a Putin apologist, or you must be paid by the Kremlin," or something like that. No, listen to me carefully. Listen. If nuclear war comes, no one will give a damn about who you think is or isn't paid by anybody. There will be dead Americans. I am 100% categorically against that. I don't ever want to see anybody in America suffer. And it is the height of stupidity and foolishness to find out how serious are they. Would they really attack America? Why do you want to find out? And who thinks that there's some wisdom or strength, show of strength, to say, I'm not going to let him make a statement like that. I'll prove him wrong. I'll make him back down. Why would you want to do that? You're allowing, whoever would say things like that, you're allowing your arrogance to put the lives of innocent Americans at risk. People who don't want a war with Russia, have no interest in a war with Russia, anybody like that. They would be the bill payers for any kind of arrogance at our national level, anybody who has the power to do these kinds of things, if we get to that stage. And we better not get to that stage. So we need to listen, because I think Russia is very clear on this. I think they mean what they're saying. That Putin himself has said many times there won't be a winner in a nuclear war. If they did this, they don't have this delusion that they would be unharmed, that they would not be, they come out unscathed. They know they would, but they're saying that if it gets to it, they're going to make sure that we also know that we would not come out unscathed. Because if you have that mentality, what he was trying to get to there, if you have this mentality in your head that we're not going to be a victim of nuclear war, you might be, some of our friends might be, but we're not going to be, then that means you may be willing to take more risk because you think you're safe, and we're not. And that's something that you better believe him on that. If you don't believe anything else he says, even though many of the things that he has said haven't come to pass, believe that one, because that's one you can only be wrong one time, and that's it. It could be existential at that point. Don't find out how serious Vladimir Putin is on that point. Now, that's the darkest moment of it. But there was also at least a reason to think hope. There's many things that Russia has shown with actions that they were willing to have a diplomatic negotiated settlement in February 2014 that electorally and democratically would have probably almost certainly come out to their disadvantage, but they're willing to follow that path. In the 2015, they were willing to do diplomacy with the Minsk agreements that would not have given them everything they want, but still would have been adequate, and they would have stopped that. They, in February of 2020, April of 2022 in Istanbul, they also showed they were willing to have diplomacy to end the war, to shut it down so that nobody else had to die. So they have shown with actions that they still are willing to do that. The one thing that Lavrov said during this interview, which was the most optimistic, is that they still, even despite all of these things and all of the lies that we had told and the actions we had taken against democracy and everything else to Russia's disadvantage and to Russia's harm, still, with Trump coming in, he said they're willing to talk the possibility of peace.
We would like to have normal relations with all our neighbors, of course, but generally with all countries on earth, especially with the great country like the United States. President Putin repeatedly expressed his respect for the American people, for the American history, for the American achievements in the world, and we don't see any reason why Russia and the United States cannot cooperate for the sake of the universe.
See, they don't want a war. They don't want to recreate the Soviet Union. They don't even want to conquer all of Ukraine. They just want their security taken care of, and their ethnic people in the eastern part of what was Ukraine. They want them to be safe. They want to have good relations with the United States. They recognize that at some point this war is going to be over. As long as it doesn't escalate into nuclear conflict, then the war will come to end through some kind of negotiations, and life will go on. The world will continue to turn, and that Russia will still be where it's at, Europe will still be where it's at, and the United States will still be where it's at. And we're all going to have to live together on the same planet. So they're saying, you heard him. He said many good things about the United States, about our people, and our great country, to use his words. So if you don't want to believe him on these other things, you might want to believe him on that, because he said there's many good things about our country. Then they want to have decent relations because they're sober-minded enough to understand you're not going to get rid of the United States, and we are all, great powers on the same stage, and we're going to have to get along with each other. So they want that. So there is a great deal of room left to negotiate and to leverage to say, hey, we kind of want the same things. You in negotiations, diplomacy, you want to find out where are the areas of common interest. Where do we both agree on? Then you start working out from there. And since we both agree that we want to keep living and that we want to have good relations, so that there is the chance for anyone to have a conflict, any rational person would certainly be thinking that way, then that means that Russia can be negotiated with. So as long as Trump comes in and understands that he's been handed a weak negotiating hand, so he's not going to be able to get some great deal for the Ukraine side or for our side, but he can get a deal that's good for America, that's good for Western Europe, that's even good for the Ukraine, the people who are still alive, to give them a future, to give them a hope that they can rebuild. They need to stop the death and the destruction immediately. And then from that point, whatever the outcome is and whatever the terms are, give them a chance to actually rebuild and continue on with their lives and stop the killing. All of those things are still on the table and very possible. We just got to make sure we can get to January 20th without any major incidents. And then we just have to just rely on Trump to make good on the things that he had said and some of the people he has in key positions. Tulsi Gabbard's one of those, obviously, who wants to talk to anybody, wants to reach for peace, has given nothing for consistently throughout her entire career that she desires peace. And so we can count on that from her and probably the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. From all that he's seen, he's going to execute what the president says he wants to do, which is to find a negotiated settlement. So there is room for some optimism here. And all it's going to take, folks, is just some sanity to keep some of the bad things from happening. So let's hope that in the remaining time between now and January 20th, the current administration doesn't take any foolish risks, because if we get to that other side, good things are still possible. That's what we're going to focus on. That's what we're going to end on today. We're going to keep on holding everybody's feet to the fire. The current administration all the way through January 20th, and the next administration, we're going to hold their feet to the fire too if things don't go good on the other side, because what we are is unintimidated and uncompromised. We will do whatever it takes to give you the truth so that you know what's actually going on. Thank you very much. And that's it for the show today, but we're going to look at another part of the world with Rajan Menon later this afternoon at, let's see, 1:30. There's advance of these Islamic radicals in Syria, and what does that mean for the region? What in the world is going on there? One of the big experts in that region, Rajan Menon, will come today to help explain why. Thanks, and we'll see you in about 45 minutes on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.